Moorish, Orthodox, Radio, Crusade, Anarchism for the global city, Radical environmentalism for the concrete jungle, Esoteric explorations of the secret history of rebel culture, the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade, exiled from WBAI in New York City, now only on the World Wide Web. Be there. Welcome aboard to the 6th Internet edition of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. Hello, all you out there in cyberspace. Well, I'm your host, Bill Weinberg, and for those of you who have been following this show for, back when it was on WBAI for 20 years, and now that it's been on the Internet for about 6 months and change, we'll be aware that our politics are rather unorthodox. We're what could be called the last of an ancient breed here in the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. We are left libertarians. We are left-wing libertarians. Yes, there is such an animal. In fact, we are not libertarian socialists. I'm sorry, we are not libertarian capitalists. We are libertarian socialists. Yes, there is such an animal as a libertarian socialist. The word libertarian has really sort of been co-opted by the free market right for at least the last generation, possibly more. But actually, we libertarian socialists, we left-wing libertarians, we had the word first. Okay, it was only later that the free market right started taking it over, because before there was Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises and so on. There was Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, and the great heroes of the anarchist tradition, which is the left-wing libertarian tradition. And we believe very strongly in individual freedom and personal liberty and all that stuff, and we believe that the capitalist system is completely incompatible with it. And what really irks me is to see the word libertarian, the proud legacy of libertarianism, being usurped by a weaselly little rascal by the name of Ron Paul. And it's not just that he's a right-wing libertarian, because I recognize that there is a legitimate right-wing libertarian tradition, which really does have consistent principles of individual liberties and free market economics. I don't agree with them. I don't agree with them on the free market economic part. I think that that individual liberties are best protected by a socialistic economic system. But I do recognize that they have a legitimate the right-wing libertarians, represented by the Libertarian Party and so on, do have a legitimate tradition. But Ron Paul is not a part of it, okay? Ron Paul is not even consistent on issues of personal liberties, and he wants to have it both ways. He calls himself a libertarian, but when push comes to shove, he's actually opposed to individual liberties. Most notoriously on the case of abortion, where he really talks out of both sides of his mouth. When he's talking to conservative voters in Iowa, quite notoriously in the prelude to the caucus there, he aired an ad on television in Iowa, making much of how appalled he is by abortion and by the death of the unborn and blah 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 blah. And saying that he's pro-life. But when he's talking to, basically confused but progressive folks who like him for his anti-war and civil libertarian rhetoric, then he'll say that he's pro-choice. But if you examine his politics, he's in fact not pro-choice. What he means by pro-choice isn't the choice of a woman to carry her pregnancy to term or not, but the choice of the states as to whether they want to ban abortion or not. So in other words, he wants to overturn Roe versus Wade and return the question to the states, which is exactly what the pro-choice movement has been fighting for the past generation. Thank you very much. So what a conniving little weasel. And then, there's numerous other ways in which he's not even a consistent libertarian, even within the right-wing libertarian tradition. The Libertarian Party, I don't agree with them on their economic formulas. I strongly disagree with them on their economic formulas. But they have a progressive position on abortion, and they have a largely progressive position on immigration. Whereas Ron Paul, talks all this anti-immigrant stuff when he's talking to, that audience, and says that he wants to repeal birthright citizenship. He wants to expunge it from the Constitution. This is the man who calls himself a constitutionalist and wraps himself in the Constitution and talks about constitutional rights and individual liberties. He wants to repeal birthright citizenship, which extends the Bill of Rights to anybody who, the protections of the Bill of Rights to anybody who was born on the soil of this country. This man is not a libertarian. He's not even a right-wing libertarian. He is, in fact, a right-wing authoritarian with a very evil, fascistic streak. And this was most amply demonstrated in a video which surfaced on YouTube. It was apparently placed on YouTube by some neo-Confederate outfit with the slightly ironic name of the Patriot Review. They seem to be more, patriotic to the Confederacy, not to the Union. And it has since been placed elsewhere on YouTube by some of Ron Paul's critics. But it's a picture of him, it's a clip of him speaking before, there isn't any date given, there isn't any place given, but he's speaking before some neo-Confederate confab, presumably somewhere south of the Mason-Dixon line, speaking in front of a giant Confederate battle flag, which forms the backdrop to the stage, giving this rant about how the South was right and that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. You can see for yourself. Let's watch the first 60 seconds.
There was there of course was an abolitionist movement in the North that got, a lot of attention back in the 1850s and leading up to the Civil War. But there was an abolitionist in the Northeast, and I think it was from Vermont, that I have a lot of respect for, and you will probably recognize his name, Lysander Spooner. Now, Spooner was a definite abolitionist. He was a Northerner. He was a Yankee. But when it came down to the war, in spite of all those identifications, he identified with the South and said the South was on the right side of the issue. And yet the war advanced regardless, and it was pursued, of course, with so much pain and suffering. And it was, and the country was led to believe, and every one of our public schools since then have preached and harped and pounded it into our kids that the only issue that was involved was slavery. And yet that was the excuse, and that was the rabble-rousing issue, and it was, you can't deny that it was an important issue. That really wasn't the issue of why the war was fought, in my estimation.
Now, what I find most personally irksome behind this rant, apart from, the fact that, somebody who's wrapping himself in the flag of the Constitution and freedom is, speaking in front of the symbol of slavery, the Confederate battle flag, what I find, that's just sort of generally abhorrent. What I find personally irksome is the fact that in this rant, Ron Paul invokes the name of the great, one of the original American anarchists of the 19th century, Lysander Spooner, who was really, right up there with H.D. Thoreau, and one of the pioneers of a of an indigenous American anarchism, and was, as Ron Paul correctly points out, a forthright abolitionist. But Ron Paul twists Lysander Spooner's position in a very ugly and insidious revisionist way to make it seem as if he actually said that he was a supporter of the South in the Civil War, in spite of being an abolitionist. This is manifestly untrue. And let us turn to the primary sources, shall we? Let us turn to the words of Lysander Spooner, which we can read from the biographical essay from the book The Collected Works of Lysander Spooner by Charles Shively, 1971, which is online at lysanderspooner.org. And let's see what they have to say about what, in fact, Lysander Spooner's actual position on the American Civil War was. Spooner devoted years to anti-slavery agitation and sent copies of his book, The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, to every congressman, convinced that if he could reach the masses, they, quoting from Lysander Spooner, they would march up to the cannon's mouth in defense of the principles of my arguments. Nonetheless, the Civil War, however, never aroused Spooner's enthusiasm as the John Brown adventure had. And I should add parenthetically here that, in fact, before the historic raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, Spooner had met in Boston, I believe. Spooner was a New Englander. Had met with John Brown, who was also a Yankee from upstate New York. And it seems that Spooner may have actually been in on it, may have at least been aware of what John Brown was planning for Harper's Ferry, and appears to have approved of it. Nonetheless, the Civil War never aroused Spooner's enthusiasm as John Brown's adventure had. He felt the war was fought on the false issue of union. It should have been fought squarely on the issue of slavery. In 1864, he published an analysis of the war in a letter to the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner. Spooner argued that, quote, the slaveholders would never have dared, in the face of the world, to attempt to overthrow a government that gave freedom to all for the sake of establishing in its place one that should make slaves of those who, by the existing Constitution, were free, end quote. In agreeing that the Constitution protected slavery and by proposing compromises in 1861 to prevent secession, Charles Sumner and others only weakened the moral position of the North, Spooner argued. Against the Northern politicians generally, Spooner charged that, quote, upon your heads, more even, if possible, than upon the heads of the slaveholders themselves, who have only acted in accordance with their association's interest and avowed principles as slaveholders, rests the blood of this horrible, unnecessary, and therefore guilty war, end quote. So, Spooner was critical of the war for legitimate reasons, but he did not take the side of the South. And in fact, he argued that the North should have been more forthright in fighting the war on the issue of slavery instead of on the issue of union. And he certainly did recognize slavery as being the root issue of the war. And he essentially was arguing, as did Frederick Douglass in the early years of the war, that Lincoln and the Union and the Republicans were too timid in aggressively confronting slavery and in recognizing that slavery was the root issue of the war. Now, you know, all of these neo-Confederate types who are breeding like rabbits these days will always argue that that the war wasn't fought to abolish slavery, and Nobody said that it was. That's not the question. Nobody said that the war was fought to abolish slavery. The question is, what was the root cause of the war? That's the critical question. Not what were Lincoln's motives, not what was the propaganda which which animated the Northern War effort, particularly in the early years of the war. The question was, what was the root cause of the war? And it's pretty clear from the historical record, as I will demonstrate, that the root cause of the war was slavery. And the South seceded because they did not trust Lincoln to uphold the Kansas-Nebraska Act and to halt the and to allow the new territories to choose whether they were going to be free states or slave states. And Lincoln made abundantly clear that he did not, in fact, oppose slavery where it already existed. He was opposed to its expansion. And the South went ahead and seceded anyway. The precursor struggle to the war, the earlier John Brown affair in Kansas, was in Kansas. The expansion of slavery into the Western territories was what was critical. The westernmost battle, which was fought in the war, was not in Texas. It was in New Mexico, which was at that point still an unorganized territory. So that was really what was the critical issue, was slavery's expansion and whether Lincoln, who had opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was the South did not trust him to uphold it and to allow the new territories to enter the Union as slave states if they so chose. That's what the war was about. And sooner or later, this became evident even to Lincoln, who initially had, much to the distress of people like Lysander Spooner and Frederick Douglass, had sort of dissimulated and equivocated and hemmed and hawed on the issue because he was still trying to buy the goodwill of the South and to buy the goodwill of the Democratic Party, which at that time was the party of slavery. Finally, Lincoln himself had to realize that, in fact, the driving issue behind the war was slavery, and that the war had to be fought on that issue, and that's when we had the Emancipation Proclamation, and that's when Frederick Douglass, who prior to that point had been a critic of Lincoln, closed ranks with Lincoln, and wholeheartedly supported the war effort, and notoriously was made Lincoln's ambassador to Haiti, which of course was an independent republic which had been founded by a slave revolt and was the first country in the Western Hemisphere, not the United States, Haiti, first country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. So Lysander Spooner never actually did kind of come around the way Frederick Douglass was, because he was just a bit more of a curmudgeon, I believe, and a little bit too much of an individualist and couldn't quite go along with the program. And the Civil War certainly was an extremely ugly and bloody affair, no doubt about it. But the moral issues behind it are being rewritten today in a very, very sinister and ugly and dangerous way. Why don't we take a brief musical break?
Now if the traitors in the South should ever cross our roads, we'll drive them to the Timberlands, St. Patrick and the Toads. We'll give them all short nooses that come just below the ears. Make strong and good of Irish hemp by Irish volunteer. They fill their glasses up, their boys, and drink a hearty cheer to the land of our adoption and the Irish volunteers. Then here's to brave McClellan and home the army now reveres. They lead us on to victory, the Irish volunteers. Now fill your glasses up, me boys, a toast come drink with me. May Erin's harp and the starry flag united ever be. May traitors quake and rebels shake and tremble in their fears when next they meet the Yankee boys and Irish volunteers. God bless the name of Washington, the nameless land reveres. Success to Maher and Nugent and their Irish volunteers. God bless the name of Washington, the nameless land reveres. Success to Newton and their Irish volunteers.
So Ron Paul has no business calling himself a libertarian, and Ron Paul has no business invoking the legacy of the great Lysander Spooner, who, while critical of the Civil War, was certainly not on the side of the South. And I repeat once more, his criticism of the Civil War was precisely that it should have been fought on the issue of slavery and not of union, because that was the root cause of the war. Google political economy. Instead of, turning it into this game of, what Lincoln's motives were in fighting the war, look at it, from the question of political economy. What were the underlying economic factors which were driving the war? And you will find that it was slavery. And all of this ancillary talk that Ron Paul brings up later on in the clip, about tariffs. Did he actually say tariffs? Yeah. He says that the issue of slavery was an excuse and the rabble-rousing issue, quote unquote, that really wasn't the issue of why the war was fought, quote unquote. And he suggests the differences over protectionism, that is to say tariffs, and the banking system were the real reason. What bunk. What bunk. Yes, those were a part of the mix, so to speak. Those were ancillary issues. The fundamental issue was slavery. What did those protective tariffs concern? They concerned what product? Cotton, grown with slave labor. Hello? It was fundamentally the slave economy that was driving the war, that was the motor force behind Southern secession. So, and the other, little weaselly equivocation, which I've heard from some of his supporters, is that this isn't, in fact, there's a post I did on this on my website, which you can go to and read all about it and read all the comments there. I finally had to cut them off because they were just too many, and too stupid. Is that it wasn't really the Confederate flag; it was the Georgia state flag back before they changed it, which incorporated the stars and bars before they were forced to change it, and the photo was carefully cropped to make it look like a Confederate flag. Nonsense! There's no evidence to indicate that. If people are saying that, it's because they want to believe it, not because any evidence indicates it. And even if it were true, completely irrelevant. It's still the stars and bars. Still the stars and bars. That's why they had to remove it from the Georgia state flag. It's like all of this talk about, Ron Paul didn't really write all of that horrible racist garbage which appeared in Ron Paul Political Report, his newsletter, for something like, 15 years? So what if he didn't write it? He signed off on it. It bears his signature. So what if he paid some ghostwriter to write it? He still has to take responsibility for it. This is what's called grasping at straws. And for those of you who are still buying into this nonsense about how the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, I suggest that you spend a little time on a library. I'm going to do a little reading. I'm going to do a couple of readings from Carl Sandburg's biography of Abraham Lincoln. Now, I acknowledge that this book is an absolute hagiography, and Carl Sandburg was very much caught up in the whole Lincoln personality cult, without a doubt. So not an objective work of history, but I believe that the passages which I'm going to read, not the part where he's gushing over Lincoln, the passages which I'm going to read all check out. Let's see here. First, I'm going to note that the original cry, which was raised for secession by Robert Barnwell Rhett of South Carolina, was explicitly raised not only over the issue of maintaining slavery, overtly and explicitly about the issue of maintaining slavery, but actually about reopening the African slave trade. Against Southern advice, the North Carolina wait until President Buchanan's term ended, Robert Barnwell Rhett and his forces had manipulated the precise dramatic event of secession. As a congressman of 6 terms and a U.S. senator of 1 term, as editor of the Charleston Mercury, as lawyer and churchman, as manager of the Charleston Bible Society, as Vice President of the Young Men's Temperance Society, as Secretary of the Charleston Port Society for promoting the Christian gospel among seamen, as the father of 12 children. The driving motive of Rhett's life was to win secession and Southern independence, build a confederacy on the cornerstone of African slavery, and restore the African slave trade, outlawed by the U.S. Constitution as of 1808. Rhett organized Minutemen, quote-unquote, and vigilance committees to make sure of delegates pledged to secession. He wrote the Ordinance of Disunion, and in secret session of the convention's 169 delegates in St. Andrews Hall at Charleston, South Carolina, December 16, 1860, passed it without debate in 45 minutes. A newly adopted flag brought a great shout, rocked the hall, and from lowlands to upcountry were bells, bonfires, torchlights, parades, shotgun salutes, and cries of jubilee. Only one by one, the 6 other cotton states of the lower South joined South Carolina in leaving the Union. So the original cry for secession was raised explicitly, not only around the issue of maintaining and expanding the slave system, but actually reopening the African slave trade. Now, it has to be said that by the time the Confederacy was organized and secession actually happened in 1861, Rhett and his original, old Confederates, so to speak, were sort of shunted aside as extremists by the more moderate faction around Jefferson Davis. And in fact, as a sort of sop to world opinion, they actually did, in the Confederate Constitution, they did outlaw the African slave trade. But it was quite explicit that maintaining, explicit, I say, overt, in the words of the founders of the Confederacy and in the actual wording of the Confederate Constitution, it was explicit and overt that their motives were to preserve the slave system and the internal slave trade, not the Middle Passage, but the internal slave trade within the Confederacy, which they hoped to expand all the way into New Mexico. So, again, I'm going to do a little bit of reading here. This is from Jefferson Davis's Vice President, Alexander Stephens, in his cornerstone speech of March 21st, 1861, boasting about the new Confederate Constitution, which had just been unveiled. I quote from Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, cornerstone speech, 1861. Quote, "The new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and the present revolution. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split." This is now Alexander Stephens quoting Jefferson. That slavery was the rock upon which the old Union would split, which I believe was from Notes on Virginia. "He was right," Alexander Stephens wrote. "What was conjecture with him is now a realized fact." End quote. Let me read that passage again. Please pay close attention here, okay? This is the Vice President of the Confederacy speaking upon the unveiling of the Confederate Constitution in March of 1861. Pay close attention. "The new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. What was conjecture with him is now a realized fact." Quote, unquote. All of you people who don't think the Civil War was about slavery, go argue with Vice President Alexander Stephens. of the Confederacy. I'll also quote briefly from the Confederate Constitution, which Stevens was lauding in his cornerstone speech in, I presume, Richmond, Virginia, in March 22nd, 1861. From the Confederate Constitution, which specifically codified the right to hold slaves. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. No bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed, quote unquote. Let me read that again. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. No bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. Right there in the Confederate Constitution. The right to hold slaves codified. The Civil War was not about slavery. Southern secession was not about slavery. Go argue with the Confederate Constitution, my friends. I'm going to read a little bit more from Carl Sandburg, another charming character. This guy, well, we noted that the man who originally raised the cry for secession, Robert Barnwell Rhett, was sort of shunted aside by the more genteel upper crust elements like Jefferson Davis when the Confederacy was actually established. But some of these more extremist elements continued to serve in high places in the Confederate Army. And one of them, of course, was Nathan Bedford Forrest, who in Memphis, Tennessee, as a real estate dealer and a slave trader, had made a fortune, bought cotton plantations, and when the war started, had an income of $30,000 a year, which was quite a lot of money at that time. He had raised several regiments, sometimes outfitting them with horses, equipment, and rations by raids on Union supply centers. So he rapidly rose through the ranks and became a hero of the Confederate Army, despite the fact that he was, well, as a slave trader, he had the faint, enigmatic odor that traditionally excluded slave traders from exclusive societies in the South. When it was urged that the war was for Southern independence and not slavery, Forrest replied, quote, "If we ain't fighting for slavery, then I'd like to know what we are fighting for," quote unquote. With some 4,000 men, Forrest moved up from Mississippi into Tennessee. This is, what year are we up to now? This would have been 1864, April of 1864. Moved up from Mississippi into Tennessee, struck at General Sherman's supply connections, enlarged and strengthened his army. At Fort Pillow, this is going to be some ugly stuff I'm about to read here. Hopefully most of you are already familiar with this, those of you who know your history and fancy yourselves experts on the Civil War, who don't think it was about slavery. Hopefully you're familiar with this escapade. This is going to be hard to take. It's kind of it makes for some very, very ugly reading. I should also note that this was Carl Sandburg writing back in the 1920s. He uses the word Negro, which we don't use anymore, but I'm going to use it because that's what he wrote back in the 1920s. At Fort Pillow on the Mississippi, 40 miles north of Memphis, Forrest, with 6,000 troops, drove the 600 defenders from the outworks into the fort, Union Fort, Fort Pillow. While his white flags of truce were in the air, he served notice that he would storm the fort. The Union commanders claimed that while thus negotiating under flags of truce, Forrest moved his troops into better positions, violating the laws of civilized warfare. Forrest regiments rushed the fort, took it, and put to death over half the garrison. Forrest claiming the fort flag had not been hauled down in token of surrender and in accord with civilized military law. Of the 262 Negro soldiers in the garrison, nearly all were killed, wounded in escape, or buried alive. The news shocked the North. press, pulpit, and politicians of anti-slavery trend, cried the affair as a fiendish atrocity demanding retaliation. Ben Wade of the Senate and Daniel W. Gooch of Massachusetts for the House were appointed a committee to find the facts. They reported, quote, at least 300 were murdered in cold blood after the post was in possession of the rebels, and our men had thrown down their arms and ceased to offer resistance. Men, women, even children were shot down, beaten, hacked with sabers. Children not more than 10 years old were forced to stand up and face their murderers while being shot. Sick and wounded were butchered without mercy, end quote. Whether one side tricked the other under a flag of truce was left in doubt. Perhaps neither side could have cleared up the point. But a historian would have to record that a certain moment arrived when forest men were no longer fighting a battle in a war between civilized nations. They were sharing in a race riot, a mass lynching, and the evidence became an orgy of unleashed primitive human animals riding a storm of anger and vengeance. Kill the goddamn nigger, ran the recurring line of the published testimony. Kill all the niggers, shouted one Confederate officer. General Forrest, riding among scattered wounded Negroes, called out that he knew some of them. They've been in my nigger yard in Memphis, quote unquote. In other words, he had owned them, quote unquote, and sold them. Perhaps half or more of Forrest's men were horrified by what was happening. What they saw was not a war, but mass murder out of race hatred. They tried to stop it, but it was a cyclone. According to a Negro private of the 6th U.S. Artillery, one Confederate officer shouted to his men, "Boys, I will have you arrested if you don't stop killing them boys." Another Confederate officer yelling the answer, "Damn it, let them go on. It isn't our law to take any Negroes prisoner. We'll kill every one of them." Repeatedly, the witnesses told of Southern officers ordering men not to shoot, or of Confederate men in the ranks pleading mercy for enemy Negroes and whites. But discipline was gone. What began as a battle ended as a race riot and wholesale murder. A telegram by General Forrest to Richmond reported driving the enemy into Fort Pillow and demanding surrender, which was declined, quote unquote. Then, quote, "I stormed the fort, and after a contest of 30 minutes, captured the entire garrison, taking 500 and killing 500 and taking 100 prisoners. I sustained a loss of 20 killed and 60 wounded," end quote. Forrest, in weeks immediately preceding the incident, had indicated that if he must storm the works, no quarter would be shown to Negro troops. His view was made clear a few weeks later when he wrote to a Union general, quote, "I regard captured Negroes as I do other captured property, and not as captured soldiers." Once again, I'll read that again. Nathan wrote in regard to what happened at Fort Pillow, quote, "I regard captured Negroes as I do other captured property, and not as captured soldiers." 6 days after the Fort Pillow massacre, Lincoln spoke at a sanitary fair, reminded his Baltimore audience that was like a temperance affair, I believe, advocating abstinence from alcohol, which was a big issue of the day. Lincoln said, quote, "We all declare for liberty, but in using the word, we do not all mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as the destroyer of liberty, especially as the sheep was a black one. Plainly, the sheep and the wolf are not agreed upon a definition of the word liberty, and precisely the same difference prevails today amongst us human creatures, even in the North, and all professing to love liberty." Very, very well said. That's a little-known quote from Abraham Lincoln, which should be better known because it really cuts to the heart of Ron Paul and all of his sinister claptrap about freedom and liberty. Once again, we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Yes, precisely. Precisely. That's exactly, all of this claptrap in the, which has been going on in the South ever since, the days of Jim Crow and the bogus doctrine of, state sovereignty in defense of the right to impose racial segregation, that, it's all about freedom. What they really mean is the freedom of the states to deny other people their freedom. And that's exactly what Ron Paul means today when he talks about, he's for choice on the issue of abortion. What he really means is that he's for, the state governments to make the choice to deny a woman her personal freedom. Don't fall for it. Don't fall for it. Just because you use the word freedom doesn't mean that you really stand for freedom. Now, what makes Ron Paul particularly dangerous is the fact that, he really does talk a good line on some issues of personal liberty, on some civil libertarian issues. And, I'm with him when it comes to drug legalization. I'm with him when it comes to bringing the troops back from Afghanistan. But as I've been saying all along on my website, worldwar4report.com, sure, he'll bring back the troops from Afghanistan to wage a race war in the streets of Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and Houston. That's what he's going to be bringing back the troops from Afghanistan for, to wage a race war at home. Don't fall for it. Don't fall for it. Think. Not everybody who talks about freedom really believes in freedom. Now, forgive me for, breaking Godwin's law here, but and I'm not saying that Ron Paul is Hitler. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. But, Hitler talked about freedom, too. Freedom from, degenerate Jewish culture and freedom from democracy and blah, blah, blah. Anybody can talk about freedom. It's a question of do you walk the walk. And when Ron Paul opposes the right to an abortion as a federally protected right, when Ron Paul opposes birthright citizenship, opposes, applying the Bill of Rights to anybody who was born on the soil of the United States of America, he does not believe in freedom. When he opposes the Clean Air Act and the Civil Rights Act and the EPA and OSHA and basic labor standards and environmental standards, he's talking about his freedom is the freedom of the big corporations to oppress us. Think about it. Think about it. Please don't drink the Ron Paul Kool-Aid. This man is no friend of freedom. He is a dangerous enemy of freedom. And the fact that he talks a good line on internet censorship and the war on drugs and the war in Afghanistan makes him more dangerous, not less, because progressive people who aren't too sophisticated are in danger of being taken in by his sinister claptrap. Wake up and think. Don't drink the Ron Paul Kool-Aid. Who are you going to vote for? Oh, I don't care who you vote for, to tell you the truth. There could well be something. I was going to say something like a Hitler. There could well be, let's put it this way. I'm going to back off a little bit. There could well be a real sort of a fascistic strongman in the immediate future of the United States of America, and he could, have a name like President Gingrich or President Santorum or President Ron Paul. And, there's a case to be made. I don't really want to talk too much about who you're going to vote for. I want to make it clear here that there's a case to be made that voting for Barack Obama is necessary just because of, how dangerous the Republicans are, including Ron Paul. But I also understand that there is a case to be made that giving the Democratic Party a blank check and saying that, the Republicans are so evil that they've got our vote no matter what is, while they, betray us at every turn, such as signing the NDAA and so on, that just gives them a blank check and actually accelerates the slippery slope towards fascism. So there's a legitimate case to be made that way too. So, you know, if you want to vote for Obama because you're so scared of the Republicans, well, you know, there's a case to be made. If you don't want to vote at all, if you want to sort of take the anarcho-abstentionist position on the basis that the entire system is a farce, well, there's a good case to be made for that as well. And if you're going to vote for a protest candidate, I would suggest the only protest candidate that I would even feel minimally comfortable voting for is Stuart Alexander of the Socialist Party. So I don't know, you know, there's a good case to be made. I'm not here to shill for Obama. Got to make that 100% clear, okay? There's a case to be made to not vote for Obama, without a doubt. But there is no case to be made for voting for Ron Paul. Do not drink the Ron Paul Kool-Aid. Ron Paul is a dangerous enemy of freedom. He is no better than Rick Santorum, no better than Newt Gingrich, and possibly worse because progressives, quote-unquote, are likely to be taken in, and you could actually build a populist base of support for a program which is ultimately deeply reactionary, pro-corporate, racist, and don't even get me started. You already did. Don't drink the Ron Paul Kool-Aid, folks. See you next time. Assalamu alaikum. Bye-bye.